Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Rowson. I am an associate of the RSA, which means I used to work here and we still like each other. It's a real great pleasure to be here. Thanks for coming. In a moment, I'm going to speak about our distinguished guest, but I just want to say that this morning I woke up and I made my bed. I realized it was a day to take the rubbish out, so I went and attended to the rubbish, and then I thought I'll wear a suit, and most of those things were because of the influence of this man. Jordan Peterson has been called the father of the internet, which is a mix.
Al Gore.
Yeah, Al Gore, yeah. And many other things. He's, by training, a scholar and a psychologist, widely cited academically. And his previous book, Maps of Meaning, which, for those who know it, is extraordinarily deep. It completely revitalized the psychology of religion. He is now a professor at the University of Toronto, previously has taught at Harvard. And we're here today to talk about his book, The 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos, and we'll come on to that in a moment. Before anything else, I have to say, please keep your phones on silent. We are tweeting today, I think. I don't think I've been given a hashtag, but we have hash RSA12 rules. Hash RSA12 rules. So please tweet if you feel so inclined. And otherwise, we'll have a chance for questions later. I'm going to speak to Jordan for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to everyone else. But before we begin, please welcome Jordan Peterson. So we have a wonderful golden hour, and we want to speak about the book. But I want to first of all get a little bit, for those who are not so familiar with your work, what brought you here? First of all, what was the story behind the book, and what kind of context does that book land in now, in this year, and this time, and this place?
Well, I probably really only figured out how to say that really succinctly in the last 2 weeks. You don't always know what you're up to. In fact, you often don't know what you're up to, that's for sure. It isn't until you have some time to look at things retrospectively that you realize it. And when I wrote my first book, Maps of Meaning, I was actually trying to solve the postmodern conundrum. But I didn't know that at the time because I wasn't particularly, postmodernism didn't have the tremendous, widespread impact it has now, but I also wasn't that familiar with it. But I was trying to understand the Cold War. And I was trying to understand two things. One was, why was it that belief systems were so important to people that they would risk putting being itself at risk to maintain the dominance of their particular belief system? So that was the first thing. And I'd already understood by that point that that was a psychological problem, not a political or an economic problem. And the second was, well, we had these two armed camps in the world, roughly the communist world and, let's say, the free world, and each of those societies were organized according to a set of axioms. And the postmodern idea would be those axioms are arbitrary in any real sense. They're arbitrary. And it's only only power in some sense can discriminate between the two. And I thought, well, that better not be the case because we're really in trouble if that's the case. But I started looking into the axiomatic structures that underlay the communist worldview and the Western worldview, and I came to realize over a period of what took me 15 years to write that first book, I came to realize that the axiomatic structures of the West were not merely arbitrary, nor were they rational precisely. They were more than rational, and that led me down two really distinct pathways. One religious, and that would be associated with the world of narrative and fiction and mythology and drama and all of that, and the other evolutionary biology and neuroscience, which are strange bedfellows. But and I laid out my argument in Maps of Meaning that the axiomatic structure of Western civilization is not arbitrary. Right. And I developed those ideas in 12 Rules for Life. I'm trying to call attention to our fundamental axiomatic principles and to say these are so true that we don't have a conception of truth that even characterizes them properly, because they are literally true and metaphorically true at the same time.
Right. Which means what?
And so, well, it means that you can derive them as first principles from evolutionary biology, and they're the primary statements of Western theology simultaneously.
Either then more true than the other, either those axiomatic, or are they somehow co-arising?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the scientific answer would be that we extracted our theological presuppositions by observing the behavioral patterns that characterized us as a consequence of evolutionary processes. That's the reductionist answer. But I don't find that answer entirely satisfying, because I don't think that we understand. I'm unwilling, even though I can, in some sense, reduce theological presuppositions to evolutionary biology, I don't think that we understand the mechanisms that drive evolution enough to make that reduction. I wouldn't dare make that reduction, let's put it that way. So the reason for that is that as I've delved into religious stories, they don't have a bottom. The more you dig into them, the more profound they become. So I'm willing to take that at face value. Now, I don't know what it means, and I don't know what that ultimately means, but none of us know what anything ultimately means.
No, true. But so the next question might help push that along a bit. So the book contains 12 rules, and we'll come to a few of them in a moment, but it's also sandwiched by two very interesting things. First is a kind of introduction, and then there's a story about your pen of light at the end. Now, I want to speak about the beginning, where you speak about a dream you had, and you're saying as a clinical psychologist you reflect upon your dreams. Can you tell us a bit about this defining dream, where you're sort of hanging from the ceiling in a church, and what it meant to you, and what follows for your understanding of your work?
Oh, you're going to ask an easy question. All right, well, so back in about 1988, I'd been working on Maps of Meaning. I worked on it about 3 hours a day, writing for 15 years, but I was obsessed by it. I was thinking about it all the time, like 16 hours a day. I could lift weights, and that would shut my mind up to some degree, but that was about all I had found. And some of my more prosaic scientific work was also a bit of an escape. But I was deeply into this material, and I was driven by the a priori presupposition that if you understood a problem, you could solve it. And that might even be an indicator of understanding. Hans Eysenck has pointed out, for example, famous psychologist, that formulating a problem is often more difficult than solving it, right? To specify the problem. So I thought if I could specify this damn problem clearly enough, then I could solve it. But I came to a problem specification, and this was how it turned out, is that, well, belief systems regulate your emotions and organize your group, so you have to have belief systems, because in the absence of them, you're nihilistic and chaotic. But if you have belief systems and other people have them, then there's going to be conflict. And we're now too powerful to engage in that sort of conflict, so for me it was you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And that was a terrible realization, because I couldn't see any way out of having belief systems or not having them. And when both led to catastrophe, then, well, it was hopeless. And so I was deeply desperate about that, because I couldn't see a way through that. And that's when I had that dream. And the dream was essentially, I was laying on my bed at home in this little apartment I had in Montreal. This is all part of the dream. And this wind descended upon me and dissolved me into particles. And then the next thing I knew, I was in this massive cathedral, and in the dome. There was a chandelier that was suspended from the ceiling, and I was in the chandelier, and I could hardly see the walls of the dome. That's how large it was, and I could see people down below, and they were just tiny, you know. And I thought, what the hell? Like, I don't want to be up in this cathedral chandelier. It's like, what the hell am I doing here, man? This isn't good. I got to get down from here. And so then I kind of realized that I was asleep. And I thought, that's good, I'll just shake myself. I was experimenting with lucid dreaming at the time. I thought, that's good, I'll just shake myself awake. So I shook myself awake, and then when I woke up, I was still in the damn chandelier. I thought, well, that's not good. That's definitely not good. And so I got down, and I don't know how, and there were people giving me hell on the cathedral floor for being up there, and I thought, oh my God, yeah, well, I didn't want to be there, and so, like, go away. So then I went back home, and when I went home, I didn't want to be anywhere a wind could get me, so I went into the furnace room, and of course that's a place of transformation. I went into the furnace room, and there's a little cot there, and I laid down there, and, you know, covered my eyes and all of that, and prepared to go to sleep, and then the wind came back, and I knew it was going to put me right back there. And I woke up, like, I was terrified at that point. I woke up, and the curtains were blowing in behind me on my bed. I was actually awake at this point, and I could see the cathedral doors in front of me when I woke up, and then I shook myself again, and I completely woke up. And that dream just bothered me to death, because there's an element of inflationary schizophrenic paranoia about it, you know, and that's the being placed in the cathedral at the center of things, eh? And so that worried me. And then I knew what the wind meant, because that's pneuma, that's spirit, right? That's the spirit that descends upon you. And it was insistent that I was going to be put back there, and I thought, know what the hell to make of this. I don't know what to make of this. I don't know who to talk to about this goddamn dream. Like, what am I going to do about this? But I thought about it for a long time. And luckily, I was reading two things at the same time. I read Carl Jung's Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, which is actually a field manual about how to respond to a dream like that. Right. Thank God. And it's the only thing like that that's ever been written. And you can't understand it unless you've had a dream like that. Right. And then the other thing I was reading, Jung basically said, don't confuse yourself with archetypal realities. Right? Do not confuse the ego and the self. That's one way of thinking about it. And so I was being placed in this central position, but the I that was being placed there wasn't the ego. Right. And so I thought, oh God, okay, I see what that is. And then I was reading Solzhenitsyn at the same time, and Solzhenitsyn pointed out quite wisely that every person is the center of the cosmos from a metaphysical perspective. And that there's a big difference between being a center and the center. Right? And that's actually the difference between sanity and insanity. Right. And so then it was out of that dream that I started to understand, it's too complicated to explain here, but I started to understand that part of the dream message was that the individual was at the center of reality. Right. And that's what a cathedral represents. Right. It's a cross with the dome of infinity on top of it. And
through that, your work on the hero myth and the individual emerged, and then all the mythology and the religion and bringing you to the rules as well.
Yeah, well, I started to understand that the alternative to group belief and nihilism was something like the continual transformation of belief and the continual quest for enlightenment and learning, that it was the quest itself rather than the consequences of the quest that were of fundamental importance, and that you could, like, you might say, well, here's what I believe firmly with boundaries, or I don't believe anything. It's like, well, those are the options. It's no, those aren't the options. That's order. That's chaos. You don't have to be either of those things. You can be the thing that's in the middle of those things, mediating between them. And that's also when I started to untangle what the Taoists meant by the Taoist symbol and all of that. So
we'll come to chaos and order in a second, but you're suspended from the ceiling, the chandelier. What, figuratively speaking, is the optimal outcome when you're suspended from a chandelier? I mean, what do you want there? Do you want to become brought back down in amongst everyone else?
Well, yes, definitely that. No, but I would say also...
Do you want them to go up? Like, how do we understand that?
Well, it's dangerous to be suspended like that. It means that you're too much in your head. Right? So there's a gap that has to be bridged. But the other danger is that it's an Icarus danger in some sense as well. It's the danger of flying too close to the sun. The optimal response to that dream, and it was inevitable anyways given the nature of the dream, was to accept that. To accept that, you say, well, I am at the center of the cathedral. Well, what does that mean? Well, I'm at the center of the cross. What does that mean? Well, that means that you're crucified. What does that mean? It means that life is suffering. What do you do about that? Accept it. Bear the weight of it. Play the drama out. That's what the dream meant. Yeah.
So,
man,
so
it's really something.
So I mean, I begin there because I mean, people, you've been called many things. You know, for some, many, and not all of them, you know, can be repeated. But you know, conservative comes up sometimes. Christian certainly comes up. Depth psychologist comes up, and many
Hitler.
others. You know, maybe
Hitler comes up.
Yeah. But I think individualist might be one of the most pertinent, if I'm not wrong. I think there's something about the way you carry yourself and what you argue, that you see something quite sacred about individual autonomy, and there's something about the individual sorting him or herself out that is quite core.
It's not even that there's something sacred about it. That is what's sacred. And that's different because, you know, sacred would be a category you could apply to anything and you could pick that. It's like, no, the source of what's sacred is that idea. Now, that's not the only sacred idea, but that's one of them. And there's a deep reason for that. And and this is where it's tied into our biology itself, is that we live in groups, obviously, and we're deeply evolved to live in groups. So that's chapter 1. I talk about the comparison between our nervous system and the nervous system of the lobster, right? Diverging 350 million years, but still adapted to the group and still using the same neurochemical systems to mediate that adaptation. It's mind-boggling. So we're adapted to the group in the deepest possible sense. But we are simultaneously, and this is the thing that's unique about people, we are the revitalizers of the group. You know, even complex animals aren't that. You know, like people say, well, do chimpanzees have culture? Right? Well, the answer to that is no, and here's why. Because let's say the chimps managed to produce a cultural increment of 1/10 of 1% per year. well, if you allow that to compound over 2 million years, you'd have us, and they're not us, and so that didn't happen. So they don't have culture. Right. Now, human beings, we're both members of a species and member of a group, but we're also the force that transforms and revitalizes the group. And that's our essential nature. That's right. What we manifest in the world. If the group is to be sustained, and if the individual is to be sustained. Right. And so it's necessary for our social structures to reflect that. Right. And then it's necessary for our articulated morality to reflect that, or we get confused and we start doing the wrong thing, like we put the group before the individual.
Okay, which brings me to rule 6. So you have many rules in the book, 12 exactly, including the last one's very cute. It's about if you see a cat on the street, you should pet it. But there's some of them are about, you know, standing up straight and watching your posture and things like this. So many rules, but one that sort of grabbed my attention, and I'm guessing others as well, is rule 6 says, make sure your own house is in perfect order before you criticize the world.
Yeah, it's a dark chapter, that one.
Dark, yeah, and challenging and controversial, and I didn't agree with most of it. You know, I admire most of the book and the ideas in it. I had challenges here, so I'll try and explain what I think they are. So apparently Mahatma Gandhi did not say, be the change you want to see in the world, which is sad for lots of people because we all love that saying, although he did live the message, right? So Gandhi did work hard on his own physical constitution. He was careful of what he ate. He made sure he managed his ashram carefully. He also was an activist. He went on salt marches. He petitioned the British government at the time. So he did sort his own life out, but it by no means ended there. He was embedded in this wider social and political conflict that he had to work on. And in the same way, when you say to a whole new generation, take responsibility, they're like, well, yeah, but my fear is that we're going to be inundated with climate change. My fear is that private actors like Google and Facebook now control the public realm. My fear is that artificial intelligence is getting way too intelligent and is actually risking taking on the world.
For you. Here's a fear.
Right.
Your attempts to fix that will make it worse.
Well, okay, this is the question, the heart of the matter. So on the one hand, you say, look, you don't have a clue what you're doing, stay out of it, right? But we live in democratic systems where it's our responsibility not to stay out of it. So how do you manage that? Because you seem to be saying...
With humility.
Humility, right. But humility doesn't preclude activism.
Generally it does, yes.
Why?
But
Why
that doesn't mean that I'm saying that there is no situations under which political action or activism is justified, because there are clearly situations under which it's justified. But it's not the first thing that you should be taught how to do when you're an 18-year-old person going to university and you don't know a damn thing.
So I don't doubt that there's callow youth. I don't doubt that people have a lot to learn. And they're
not learning it from their professors either.
That may be true. That may be true. But you're clearly, I mean, a big part of your narrative comes from that energy of resisting that kind of, you know...
Circumventing it.
Circumventing, but you're also saying, you know, these people who complain about the world, they should just focus on their own, what they can control themselves and work within that space.
To begin with.
To begin with, but equally, there is a slight derision in the tone about people who actually care about bigger than self issues.
It's not slight.
Okay, it's big then. So, bigger than self problems, which arguably...
They don't care about them. They just act like, they're just acting out the delusion that they care about them, generally.
You seem to be caught up
I watch activists, the activists at the universities.
Right.
I know what they're like.
And we've seen the videos and we know that kind of confrontation. Yes. And I don't
We've seen Wilfrid Laurier, for example.
I've seen many, but I don't doubt that there are those who are like that. But there are many millions more, and I mentioned Gandhi, but, you know, arguably...
You can't use him as an example.
Okay, well, Buddha, for example.
Or
Buddha left his wife and child.
Yeah, but you can't use them as examples.
Okay,
first of all, like Buddha's like Christ. It's like, well, there's Christ. It's, yeah. What do you mean?
No,
there's Christ in university activists?
No, but there's...
Like, no.
Well, there's... so Martin Luther King, can I use him?
Yeah.
Right? So Martin Luther King had an affair. It was quite well known. You know, his personal life was a bit complex.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't say that, you know, he had to sort that out before he went to sort of try and deal with civil rights in the US. So I'm trying to get at the core of the tension.
No, I would say that his own personal faults didn't preclude his social responsibility. Right. And it really is important to get that straight. But I would say that his own personal faults served as a detriment to his overall mission. Right. And then I'm not, believe me, I am not saying that if I was in Martin Luther King's position, I would have done a better job. It's like, I am not saying that, man, not in the least. But back to the idea of sorting yourself out. It's like, well, first of all, it's a lot harder to do than you think. Yeah. I mean, I've run students through this experiment. We used to do existential experiments in my Maps of Meaning class, and so the existential experiment was identify one thing that you think that isn't going well that you could fix. And then go try to fix it. and then just document what happens. It's like, well, you know, it's way hard. So let me tell you a brief story. I had one student whose mother had died, and the house was chaotic, and no one had picked up the necessary domestic responsibilities. And so he decided, and that wasn't good for anyone, and so he decided that he was going to step into the shoes of his mother. Well, God, I mean, it just provoked a complete bloody war in the household, you know, because who the hell did he think he is, and why do we need that, and why are you doing that, and aren't you making us lonesome for Mom, and, you know, why do you think that you're better than us by taking up this responsibility? And so it's like, this, I'm going to go buy groceries. That was his plan. It's like, well, you know, that's a hell of a lot harder than you think. Yeah. And so, number one, cleaning up your room is proper because maybe you can manage it, although probably you can't, because you could also extend that by beautifying it. But number two, it involves way more forces than you think. Yeah. And so, because to get your house in order is very, very difficult.
But if it's so difficult, and I need to spend most of my energy and time dealing with that, who are the people who are going to be doing the other work that needs to be done socially and culturally and politically?
Well, hopefully competent people, right, with any luck. People who've already done that.
You say, okay, that's interesting. So you're saying it's a necessary transition. You're saying there's something about the life...
Jesus, I'm saying something simple. If you can't make your damn bed, quit waving placards at corporations. It's like, Jesus, it's like, seriously, man. It's like, what the hell? What makes you can't get this tiny little part of the world that's actually right at your feet, functional. You have contempt for it. It's just my bedroom.
That seems like gratuitous caricature of people. I mean, look...
It's not gratuitous.
Well, their flip on that is, look, why should I waste my time making my bed when we've got to deal with these problems in the world? You know,
because you risk inflating your own ego by dealing with the problems of the world. So, it's like it's the cathedral problem again. It's like, oh, I should be at the center of the universe.
Right. So
it's like, yeah, well, maybe not.
I'm trying to find a resolution of this that goes beyond the existing cultural conflict around it. Because no doubt people need to attend to their own projection and their own limitations and have humility and some psychological insight and work harder on what they're directly responsible for. I don't doubt that. But I am concerned with a message that says that's all you should be doing, and until you figure that out, don't do anything else. No, I'm not saying that's all you should be doing. But you are saying you have to do it first. Before you can do that, you should be very leery of assuming that when you try to do something else, you won't just make it worse. And you will. Right. Look, I've dealt with people who've dealt with complex systems for a very long period of time. Right. And I know the difference between someone who can make a complex system better and someone who will make a complex system worse. And most people will make a complex system worse. Okay. That's for sure. So that's... Okay, that's good, because that's coming to the question of development and the question of human maturation and the question of what it means to unfold throughout the lifespan. So just to try and distill that last point, you're sort of saying don't begin and end with your own responsibility of cleaning your room and sorting your personal and immediate affairs out, but realize that until you can do that, you may be lacking certain forms of competence that might make you doubt whether you should be quite so visceral and adamant about your political views.
Precisely that, yes, and it's exactly the opposite of what students are taught in universities.
But you're not saying don't care about those things or don't act on them, but just while you're doing them, attend to your own limitations and competencies.
Well, I'm saying you should be aware of your own competence and your limits, and that's especially true if you're very young, because like, what the hell do you know? You haven't done anything. You're like, I tell 18-year-olds, 6 years ago you were 12. It's like, what the hell do you know? You haven't. You're under the care of your family or the state. You haven't established an independent existence. You haven't had children. You haven't started a business. You haven't taken responsibility for anything. You don't have a degree. You haven't finished your courses. You don't know how to read. You can't think. You can't speak. You're ill-kempt. You don't know how to present yourself. Well, Jesus, you know, and it's just not right to tell people in that situation that they should go out and change the socioeconomic structure of the culture.
What those children or young people observe are not wise adults managing complex systems adeptly. They see people giving subsidies to fossil fuel companies. They see people
they see activists teaching them at university who are no smarter than they are. Jordan, and they think, well, I can do that.
You're so hung up on the university experience. We keep coming back to this issue of the activists at the university, which is clearly very salient for you. But for those who are not there, it's frankly alienating. Because your other work is so fantastic, but it keeps coming back to this narrative of these slightly callow students who are maybe a bit over-enthusiastic about a political issue.
Well, I'm more concerned with their professors than with the students.
Okay, also the
and I'm
professors
concerned
supporting
about
them.
the professors because they've completely corrupted the humanities.
Right.
And the humanities are the core of the university. And by corrupting the humanities, they're corrupting the fundamental structure of our civilization. And they're spreading that out into the general culture.
Right. But
and there's no excuse for that.
They may be doing that, but simultaneously others are corrupting the ecological foundations, the social foundations. Democracy is arguably dying. There are real problems that are existential threats at a different level.
There's a
Multiple,
whole large
yeah.
variety of
Right.
existential
And I don't
threats.
think that's happening principally because some people are being taught feminist theory in the University of Toronto. It's not that. It's something else, much bigger and broader and deeper, that when people raise these issues, you focus on that small issue, not the big ones that they're worried about.
Well, it depends on the issue, I suppose. I would say that...
climate change, for example, just for argument's sake.
Well, what should I say about climate change?
Well, what should you do
Did you
if you're
drive
young-
here?
If you're, no, I didn't.
What did you do? How did you get here?
I took public transport.
Okay, well, you know.
But that's not really, but again, that's hardly the point. I mean,
Well, no, it is the point.
Well,
it is the point because it's part of the problem with climate change is irreducible complexity.
Right.
It's like, you know, there's a cost to our existence, and the cost is externalization.
Yeah.
Right, externalization of costs, and we don't know how to manage that.
Right.
And I would say, should we be concerned about it? It's like, yeah, absolutely. Do we know how to be concerned about it? Not really.
Not really, right. So then how do we learn? That becomes the question, right? So the younger generation who are
I
likely
can give
to
you
be
an example.
more directly affected, the kinds of people in developing countries and younger people who feel the pinch of this all the more because they can see, for example, New York, the chance of it being underwater by the end of the century is not negligible. And therefore, they're looking for a response that really matters to them. And when you think about responsibility,
That's
they think,
easy. That's
No, but
easy.
their view is don't patronize me about my bedroom when I've got the planet to save.
I'm not patronizing you. I think
No,
your
not
bedroom
me.
is
I'm
important.
just saying that there is a
No, I know.
There is a voice.
No, I understand. I think your bedroom is important.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they
No,
might
but I
too,
seriously
but they think the
that.
whole planet is more important. They're more concerned about that. And why is
Your
that wrong?
bedroom is a microcosm of the planet.
Right. Well, tell
Yes.
us about that then. Why is
Well,
that the case?
let's go back to the climate issue here first, because there's this guy that I'm aware of. His name is Boyan Slat, and I'm going to talk to him in the relatively near future, I think. And he's a model for young people. He went out scuba diving when he was 17, and there was a lot of plastic, and that sort of bothered him. And then he started thinking about manta rays and how they move through the water, and then he noticed that most of the plastic was in the top 6 inches, and then he thought, I wonder if I could build a machine that was like a manta ray that would float on top of the water. And anyways, to make a long story short, he's devised a way to rid 50% of the plastic in the world's oceans within 5 years, and has spent the last 6 years developing that and is well on the way to implementing it, and it looks like it might work, and he's going to be able to make a profit from it, just to add that extra bit of punch. And so Boyan Slat, I would say, it's like, I don't know if his room was clean or not, but there was something about him that was dead on, because when he looked at a problem like that, he thought, I'm not going to go out there and tell a bunch of other people what they're doing wrong so that they can solve it. I'm going to bloody well fix it. And that's what I'm telling young men in particular to do. Although, if young women want to do that, it's like, great, more power to them. But, people say, well, I'm taking climate change seriously. I'm going out to protest. Like, you're not taking it seriously. That's not serious. Serious is you're going to devote 80 hours of your life to it for the rest of your life, right? You're going to work on that so intently that you're not even going to think about anything else. Like, that's serious.
So what you care about is clarity of intent. And real purpose, the real sort of what's the underlying motivation of these activists. It's not that they have the wrong concern as such.
Oh, they might even have the wrong concern, but there's error at all dimensions. They're not taking anything seriously.
But my point is they can't wait for the grown-ups to fix it, nor do they really feel they have the time to become sufficiently mature and complex to deal with the adept dealing with a complex system that, frankly, none of us really know how to deal with at that level.
They have to wait for that, because you can't fix a military helicopter unless you're a mechanic.
Right, but with
So
regards,
there's no but. It's just as simple as that. Is you cannot fix a complex system unless you understand it. You can't. Even if the thing is spiraling out of control, it's like, well, we need to fix this right now.
Well, look, the language of fixing isn't helpful here because it's not a mechanical problem. It's a social, cultural, ecological, political problem. But in that context, there's a whole generation of people who, on the one hand, they get the idea that they have to sort themselves out, and they have to learn, and they have to become expert, and they need to really understand what they're working on. And many of them do, and those are and that's great. But to disparage those who are actually caring about the issue, are you saying that, look, they're basically showboating? They're just kind of showing off. It's kind of empty rhetoric. Okay.
Yeah, they're definitely. It's worse than that.
Right.
It's compassion masking uselessness most of the time.
So let's stay with that for 1 second, because the critique of you from, not the left, because that doesn't really help us, from sociologists, let's say, is that, look, you have enormous psychological depth, you're a charismatic, brilliant teacher, no one doubts any of those things, but you don't have any sociological imagination. You don't have any vision of how the world ought to be, or any sense of how we get there. You just want people to go and tidy the room. How do you answer that?
They should read the book, because that's just not true.
Well,
it's not even vaguely true.
I mean, it's an imagined audience here, but I've read the book, and to some extent I think that is true. I mean, I sense enormous depth and insight. I mean, hugely admire your work. But I do feel well, I noticed two things. One is that, you know, if I may, you have wonderful folksy charm and a lot of composure when you're speaking about matters of the psyche, matters of religion, and when you're speaking about your own experience. Then I'm all in. But then there's often moments where you flip into the social and political domain, and then you feel this enormous latent rage and anger that doesn't feel in keeping with the rest of your character, and I wonder if that's because you don't know the material as well. That's how it feels.
Which material?
Political, cultural, sociological issues that are not as close to your core of expertise as the rest. So something like climate change, maybe artificial intelligence.
Well,
maybe
I don't claim to be an expert on climate change.
You don't, but
sure.
No, I understand that. I appreciate it. And humility
I don't think anybody's an expert on climate
change. No, they're
change.
not. I agree, which is a huge part of the challenge.
I'm also very skeptical of the models that are used to predict climate change.
That's also fine, and you mentioned humility as a key part of what we need to acquire, and I accept that. But it does rancor with many people that the sort of rage and anger you feels a bit misdirected. It's like if that could be channeled towards actually dealing with the complex problems we face, rather than attacking the people who trying in their own failing way to deal with it.
When the academics in Canada quit comporting themselves like they did in the Lindsay Shepherd case, then I'll stop being irritated at their existence.
Okay.
That was absolutely unacceptable. It was the biggest scandal that ever hit a Canadian university. It was a Maoist inquisition.
You're now you're now a global thinker with millions of followers. What happened at the University of Toronto was formative, no doubt, but I don't even know who you're talking about. You know, I don't know those experiences. I can't relate to them. What I do know is that, like many other people, I care about the challenges in the world. I realize that, you know, I have huge limitations in trying to deal with them, and it's a bit absurd even sometimes to try and deal with them. Nonetheless, here we are.
No, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to try to deal with them.
You know, democratic systems, the power is with the people. You have to try and somehow do your best.
Right, exactly. That's my point.
Good, right. So on that point,
yeah.
See, and this is the last point from me before I open out, because it's a big point, but I hope you can deal with it. You mentioned the postmodern conundrum, and you mentioned that a way out of that might be, in one of your lectures, that sort of developmental view of life, but Piagetian view of life perhaps, is a way of understanding how people grow and learn and complexify, vis-a-vis our last conversation. What is it about that complexification process we need to understand better, and how might it help us resolve some of those conflicts?
Well, one of the things, and this is an idea that I've been trying to articulate more precisely, more recently, is, I suppose, is that, as I mentioned before, I don't think that the axioms of Western civilization are Western axioms. Right. I think they are accurate articulations of universal axioms. Right. And I would say technically the axioms that we have learned to elucidate first, let's say, for better or worse, are the axioms of, they're the description, they're the philosophical description of the rules of games that can be played iteratively and that self-improve. Right. So imagine society as a sort of game, which it is. It's a voluntary agreement to comport ourselves in a particular way, and that there could be many such voluntary agreements. But the voluntary agreements have to be bounded in a way that the postmodernists have failed to appreciate, which is why I like Piaget, because a game can't just be any old game. As you know, if you're 4 years old, you learn that it can't be any old game. You know, if you want to be a popular 4-year-old, what you do is, especially when you're setting up the stage for dramatic play, is you gather your friends around and you say, look, like, we're going to play out this alternative reality, that's the pretend space, and you're going to be this character, and you're going to be this character, and you're going to be this character, and is that okay with you? Because everybody has to want to play. Otherwise, it's not a good game. And so everybody says, yeah, okay, you know, I'll take that. I don't want to be house cat, you know. I want a better role. And all the kids get together, and then they play out the the reality and you can say, well, there's a very large number of games like that children can play, and that's true, but they have to be playable, and that means that the participants have to want to play.
Right.
Okay, so we have to organize our society in ways that people want to maintain,
right.
and that restricts the number of viable options. But then we also have to organize them, and this is also part of, you might say, game theory, I suppose, but part of evolutionary biology as well, is that, well, the game you play can't degenerate. Like, you want to play a game with your wife, let's say. Well, it can't be just a game for today. It has to be a game for today that also you can play tomorrow and next week, and that doesn't interfere with those games, and that you can also play in a year and 5 years and 10 years, and that you can play with your kids and with your father-in-law and all of that. And man, that's starting to constrain the game like mad. And then you might add another criteria, which is, well, not only does the game have to maintain itself as playable, but it has to get slightly better as we continue to play it. It's like...
So what does slightly better look like today? What is the iteration on the apparent cultural conflict we have between those who are saying, inclusive, I have my rights, you have to respect this pronoun, you're saying that this is all nonsense?
Not all of it.
Not quite, you're not quite. But how do you move on from that kind of fractious, unenlightening discussion?
You lay out a better game.
Which is?
Well, that's partly what we're doing in this discussion.
Right.
Is like, because let's say that you're a player in the game that I just described. Well, you want to be a good sport about it. That's a good way of thinking about it. And this is all based in Piagetian ideas in some sense, because he was so interested in games. It's like, you have to learn to be the master of the game, of the set of iterable games that the set of iterable games that improve across time. You could say, well, that's the basis for morality. And that was a Piagetian idea, which is a bloody brilliant idea. And then there's more to it, because you could say also that iterable games eventually become not a social construct, but part of the biological fabric. Yep. So, for example, dominance hierarchies. That's a good example. Yeah. A dominance hierarchy is an iterable game. It's not an optimal game, I would say. Right. But it's an iterable game, and it's been iterated for 1/3 of a billion years. Right. And although it was an emergent property to begin with, because it was so stable, it became part of the evolutionary landscape, and now we're adapted to it. Right. And so some of the iterable games become part of the environment themselves. Right. And we need to conduct ourselves in concordance with that, I would say. Right. And then I would also say that the ideals of the West, and that particularly is encapsulated in the notion of the logos. Right. The logos is the manner in which you conduct yourself if you're the best player of the set of iterable, improvable games. Right. That's basically what it is. Now, it's not just that. Right. And it's a broad concept, because if you're that player, there's a bunch of other things that you do. Right. For example, you tell the truth when you lay out the rules. Right. When you're honest and people can rely on you, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So that's the postmodern notion, of course, is that a finite number of entities has an infinite number of interpretations. That's true. It's technically true. It's what brought AI to a halt for like 30 years while people were trying to sort out how to make machines perceive reality, because perceiving reality turned out to be way more complicated than people thought. So it is true that there's an infinite number of potential interpretations. What is not true is that there's an infinite set of viable interpretations. And you can actually parameterize viable. And that's actually what you do with your emotions, right? If you're like in agony, that's an indication that you're not playing a viable game, right? And you might say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with objective truth, but that's beside the point when you're in agony, right? I mean, it's just beside the point. There isn't an infinite set of iterable games that improve themselves across time. There might only be one game like that. Right. Well, it's just
biology, basically.
Well, it's more because of situational constraints. It's just so hard to conduct yourself right now in a way that improves how you're going to be in a week or a year, right? It's just there aren't that many pathways that allow for that.
I'll try one, which is to involve the audience.
Okay.
Because I'm sorry I've slightly overused my time, but now I'd like to invite you to give me some questions. I'll take a few at a time because of the time issue. Try and keep it as succinct as you can, please. And we'll begin with, where's the mic, please? Just the back. If you come around here, please. Yeah, we'll have one at the front here. And then after that, if we can pass it back. And we'll take these 3 questions first, please.
I'm interested in how much of of what you have to say is more aimed at men, right, and how much aimed at women. I occasionally get little flickers of a sort of Kinder, Küche, Kirche thing, which I hope isn't there.
Great. Sorry, the last phrase?
The Kinder, Küche, Kirche, women, the children, kitchen.
Yep.
Church.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I like a lot of what you say, and I hope very much that's just...
We'll hold the gender... That's a big question, so we'll come back to that. Yes, the gentleman behind you, please.
You talk about a system of beliefs. Does these beliefs need to be religious, or somebody being humanistic, for example, can play your game?
Okay, great, thank you. And then there's one behind you, we'll take that as well.
How is it that if Western society is the optimal state of biological and metaphorical existence for human beings, that in Western society we've constantly evolved to a point of university education which stands behind the principles of challenging the outside world and actually engaging in activism, because it's not really youth that you critique, because you've already given your example of the Great Ocean Cleanup Project made by a young person. It is literally those elements of activism, things they do, things that goes on. But that has been integral in development for young people in Western society.
Okay, great. So those three rich questions. I want to begin with the gender one, because for those who heard it, there was a Radio 5 live interview that you had, I believe, yesterday, where you ended on a very emotional note about this question, about the fact that people coming to your lectures are roughly 80% men, and often men under sort of 35 or so, saying thanking you deeply for sort of recognizing them and the challenges they're facing. But there are also those who feel the mood music is somehow wrong, that somehow this hasn't caught up with the last 50 years of gender emancipation and so forth, and there's slightly too much fixation on men and women being somehow, their mode in life is to attract the suitable mate, and that comes up a lot in the book, by the way. So how do you feel about the gender question? Why are men particularly drawn to your work, and to what extent can you maybe redress the balance a little bit in terms of what people are hearing?
Well, it isn't obvious to me why men particularly are drawn to my work. It might just be a side effect of YouTube, for all I know, because YouTube is where I put my lectures, and YouTube is primarily men. Now, why that is, I don't know, any more than I know why Tumblr is primarily women. So it could be just a sample bias, as far as I can tell, but maybe it's not. Maybe there's something that men are more desperate for at the moment than women, and I think that's probably true, because I think that men are in a more in a state of existential crisis than women are. And it's partly because it's kind of obvious what women should do. You know, it's like, well, yeah, they should have a career and have a family. It's like, well, that'll keep you busy, especially between the ages of 20 and 35. It's like, that's enough, man, to try to get those two things right. And you have to do it before you're 35.
And and it's different for men because?
Well, men don't have to do it before they're 35.
So just age-wise?
Yeah, but it's not just. I mean, age kills you. It's a big deal. You know, and like you can have a family when you're 60 if you're a man. So you can sit around in your mother's basement till you're 40 and you still have a chance of flourishing. Not much of one, but still some. You know, so women are in a much tighter time frame, and so I think that they're quite oriented towards action in the world, and quite desperately oriented. And you know, that's a catastrophe because it's desperation, but it also gives them purpose. That's for sure. And then with regards to the gender question more broadly, it's like there seems to be this idea that if I'm concentrating on strengthening masculinity, I would say rather than men, by the way, just to be properly postmodern about it,
well done.
That in some sense I would be doing women a disservice. It's like, what the hell is that supposed to mean?
No, I don't think it's disservice. It's something about people's perception of tone. Are you just saying that's just the way it is, that actually that's more issue with the hearer than the speaker? Because I've heard a lot of people say the same thing, which is that you speak very forthrightly and clearly about masculinity. You connect it to the logos. You speak about order and chaos, and the masculine principle being the kind of ordering and the chaos being the feminine. And you know, people read that today and go, "Are you sure? That's a bit controversial." That kind of thing.
Well, I think part of it too is that we don't have a good mythological pattern for modern femininity. Right. Because modern females aren't like females 200 years ago, because they got control of the reproductive function. And so there isn't a deep mythos for a modern woman, because there have been no women in history that got control of the reproductive function. You might say, well, what is a woman who has control of her reproductive function like? And the answer to that is, we don't have a clue. Right. It's only been around for 50 years. Right. So what's the ideal for femininity? Well, you know, that's part of the culture wars. We don't know. Okay.
And I'm sure there's someone who could be on stage who could ask you a brilliant rejoinder to that comment, but it's not me, alas. The question about belief systems. This is interesting about religion, because on the one hand, you're fearlessly going back into the Christian mythology and Bible stories. On the other hand, there's a little bit of equivocation about, are you simply saying God exists, Jesus was Son of God, and we should follow the Bible?
Say that.
But it can sound a little bit, you can't simply say it, I correct myself. But there are moments where it feels like that is the good old religion that you're offering. But I don't think that's the whole story either. So other belief systems, if you want to construct a sort of humanistic belief system or even create a new religion, what's the challenge there?
Well, good luck with the latter. I mean, you know,
people
that's just
try.
not
I
good.
mean,
yeah, they do. And generally the results aren't good. You know.
But you've distinguished between ideology and religion before. Maybe that's a good way of trying.
Yeah,
to...
well, the ideologies are fragmented religions. Essentially, they use the same symbolic understructure, but they only tell part of the story. I could give you a quick example of that. I'll do it very quickly. So. When the American West was settled, it was settled on the wave of an ideological story.
Right.
And here's the story. Heroic individual, that's positive, bringing positive culture, that's the wise king, into virgin or into chaotic territory. That's the negative mother, essentially. So that's positive individual, positive culture, negative nature, right? And that's a motivating story, man, to heroically bring order into the untamed wilderness. It's like 1 million people a year from Europe come driven by that narrative.
Yep.
It's okay, well, here's the counter-narrative. Raping and pillaging individual, bringing the despolations of tyrannical culture into the virginal, wonderful, environmental, what would you call it?
Utopia?
Yes, of nature.
Yep.
It's like, yeah, man, you can get a long way with that story too.
Yeah.
But they're both half the story. So you just put those two things together, and you have a religious story. It's like, well, the individual is heroic, but also is an adversary, and a cruel adversary at that. Culture is the wise king, but it's also the evil tyrant. And nature is beautiful and wonderful French impressionistic landscape, and cancer, and Anopheles mosquitoes, and elephantiasis. And so if you are properly oriented in the world, you tell yourself both those stories, and you say, oh my God, they conflict. It's like, yeah, they do, man, that's exactly right.
Okay.
So an ideology just pulls out a subset of the religious characters and says, this is the entire reality.
Right.
It's like, no, it's not. Right. It's a parasitical meme,
right.
essentially. An ideology is a parasitical meme on a religious substructure. Okay. And then there was a question about religion. You know, can people from other religions play the game? Well, it might depend on the specifics of the religion, I would say, but there's no reason that people can't play the iterable, improving game.
Yeah.
I mean, I've spent a lot of time looking at Taoism, for example, and you know, it seems its fundamental presuppositions seem very much commensurate with some of the basic conceptions of Western Christianity, say. Yeah. There are important differences between religions, and so they have to be taken into account as well.
The third question was good because it tied in a lot of themes. So as I understood it, he was sort of saying, look, you often speak about how we should be grateful for the civilization we have and how far we've come in many ways, and we shouldn't sort of attack many of the main tenets of our current world.
Not without gratitude.
Not without gratitude, yeah. But equally, a lot of that achievement, a lot of the kind of world we enjoy, and you mentioned female emancipation in various ways, a lot of that has come about through enormous strife. So to come back,
female emancipation came about because of the birth control pill.
Okay, well, coming back...
No, really, not just okay. It's like, this is the narrative. The 60s rebels rose up and emancipated women. It's like, no, the birth control pill was invented and there was political consequences.
The question was a little different, which was
Yeah.
about the role that activism and protest had played in creating that civilization, as I understood it. So to take, for example, the suffragette.
Yeah.
You know, suffragette seeking the right to vote may well have had big personal problems in her household. You know, the injunction to her is surely not, get on with your husband, see what he needs and attend to it, or tidy your room. The injunction there is find a way to fight, chain yourself to railings if you have to, but find a way to get the vote.
Yeah, well, what I would have to do in a situation like that is take a look at the people who were the ones that were the real foremothers of the movement, let's say, and understand what gave them the characterological strength to prevail. Okay. And my suspicions are that the ones that were successful had a very powerful personal ethic, right. And that's what made them successful. So, and I mean, I've seen this in all sorts of realms of competence, let's say. It's, okay. It isn't their desire to engage in activism per se that makes them effective. It's the fact that they bring their characterological strength to that movement and can prevail as a consequence.
Okay, great.
And I'm certainly not saying that people shouldn't engage in social criticism. No. It's like, I've been engaging in social criticism, much to my chagrin, but it was, you know, the government decided that it could tell me what I had to say. Yeah. It's like, that's not happening.
No, sure. And that's the useful clarification. So we have about 5 minutes. I want to take a few more questions and then one rounding off answer. So we're going to have to be brief and to the point, please. Yes, one gentleman here.
In the realm of Austrian economics, we talk a lot about time preference, and one thing that I think it's a theory of like Hans Hermann Hoppe or something like that. And recently, I was thinking, you're talking about the sexual revolution and the birth control pill and everything. Do you think that with this new technology, you know, that's kind of been more of like a maybe an endogenous shock, to the economy, to the dating market, whatever. A time preference is like, you have a high time preference if you want something now, quickly, or like a wage, or if you have a low time preference if you want an investment,
question,
something like that.
What
I'm trying to say is, like, how would we actually lower our time preferences a lot more, like men and women, like everything, with all this hookup culture and all that goes on these days?
What do you mean by
That's a good question.
I don't understand the question. I don't think everyone else necessarily did.
I can translate it.
Okay, translate it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I've got it. Oh,
Yes,
shall I go?
go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think what you're making reference to is the conundrum that time preference poses. It's like, how much is for now and how much is for later? Is it something like that? Something like that. Okay. Well, the way that you deal with that is through dialogue, essentially, because it's an untenable problem. You can't tell. You're always approximating, and it also, the optimal answer to that question also varies with the situation. Like an emergency now takes preference over later. In fact, that's how you're wired biologically, right? So in order to get the balance between what is now and what is later proper, we use free speech to elucidate the problems, and then we engage in dialogue about the range of possible solutions. And it's like a market answer to the problem, essentially. It's something like that.
Thank you, Jordan. There was a few more hands there. Can I just have them up again? Yes. One at the back and one. Okay, we'll have two more questions and that's it. So, gentleman in the blue and then lady, sorry, the third one came in a little too late. And there's two there if we can get them. But please be to the point. Thank you.
I'm probably doing a grave disservice posthumously to Marcel Proust, but I remember him saying that it's important that we should always leave a part of our world chaotic, our room, our study, our bedroom, perhaps, because the world itself is ultimately chaotic, and we need to be reminded of that. So should we learn to love the chaos?
Yeah, okay, we'll hold that question. And then two more here.
You mentioned the word democracy early on. So many regimes, countries have corruption, others that are in theory democratic, lots of people don't vote. How would you cure the issue of democracy?
Okay, a small one there. Okay, that will do. I think that's fine. Take those two. I'm sorry for those who missed out. Was there one there as well? I don't think so. Yes, just take it because we did say yes earlier.
Thank you. You mentioned crisis in the universities in humanities. I just wondered if you could clarify what you meant by that.
Okay.
80% of humanities papers go uncited.
Right, good answer. And then the other two questions are big. So first of all, on chaos and order,
yeah.
That's a big theme in your book, but we have to deal with it briefly.
Yeah, well, there's always a snake in the garden. Right. So then the question is, do you get obsessive about chasing out the snakes? Or do you learn how to engage in combat with them? And that's the right answer. It's like, it's better to, you can't eradicate the last element of chaos. You can try to make things orderly and tidy and safe as you can, but you don't make your children safe, you make them strong. And you do that even by setting them an optimal challenge, because you can't, if you're going to have a bounded place, there's going to be snakes in it. And so you can try to minimize them, but there's an eradicable element of chaos, and the way that you deal with that is to strengthen the individual, essentially.
And if there was a defining theme of the book, I'd say it's the interplay of chaos and order, personally. Democracy, last moment, now.
Strengthen the citizens.
Okay.
That's the right answer to that, as far as I can tell. It's like,
and how?
Make better citizens. Well, first of all, you could tell them a story about why responsibility is not only necessary, but desirable. This is one of the things that's so interesting about the response of young men in particular. It's like, I'm selling the most unsaleable possible package of messages, right? It's like, there's something true about Christianity. It's like, yeah, sure, right. I'm going to sell that to young men. No, that's not going to happen. I'm going to tell them that they should adopt more responsibility and stop being so damn impulsive and tell the truth, and they're all going to be like really happy about that. Well, that's what's happening. So I don't know why it is, but it's partly because I can actually tell a story about responsibility. People have been told for 50 years that the meaning in your life comes from freedom and rights. It's like, no, that's not right. I mean, sometimes it's right because you're so goddamn oppressed that, the system has to be fractured to give you a little bit of freedom. But at the moment, that's not the case. The case is that you're going to find most of your meaning by picking up your damn load and stumbling forward. And it's like, that's how you respect yourself. And that's a huge part of what the book is about. It's like, there's a lot wrong with you. You're fragile, you crumble, you age, you die, you're weak, you're ignorant, and you're touched by malevolence, and a lot of it is willful. It's like, what the hell, man? How can you look at yourself in the mirror? You're such a miserable mess. And the answer to that is, pick up something heavy. right? Something that's a benefit to you and the rest of the world, and stumble forward mightily with it. And then maybe you can tolerate your miserable existence without becoming a blight on reality.
Okay,
so, and people find that funny
Yeah,
as well.
I
It's
think
like, it's, you know, it's funny. It's like...
So a lovely sort of tragicomic moment to end on. There is a book signing outside. It's a wonderful book. I strongly suggest you purchase it, and Jordan will sign it. We also have a mirror and a heavy load to carry. Just below. No, I'm just kidding. Really, that's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing so widely. Thank you.